Hello, my name's Aviva and welcome back to my channel. So today I wanted to talk about a handful of series that I wish I DNF'd. Usually when I pick up a series or any book in general, it's because someone recommended it to me or because I see it all over the internet and I kind of get pulled into the hype of it. And most of the time that goes really well for me. You know, I really enjoy watching people's recommendations, taking their word for it. If they enjoyed it, I'll probably enjoy it if we have the same reading tastes. And anyway, most of the time that works out really well. But in this instance, for the books I'm about to mention, it didn't go so well for me and I wanted to share why. So the first series I wanted to talk about is the Diviners series by Libba Bray. And this consists of 4 books. It's the Diviners, Lair of Dreams, Before the Devil Breaks You, and King of Crows. And if you're not familiar with what this series is about, this is a paranormal story told in multiple perspectives in 1920s New York City. And it sounded really good when I heard about it. A lot of booktubers were mentioning it for a while, saying that this is one of their favorite series of all time. And I usually trust booktubers' recommendations. And this sounded like a book that I've never read before, and I figured I should pick it up. So I did, and I didn't like it, and I read the entire thing, and I wish I didn't bother. Mostly because of every element of this book. I mean, I didn't realize that the paranormal wasn't fantasy. This was the first paranormal book I ever picked up, and I wasn't a fan of the whole thing of it. Like, I didn't realize that paranormal and supernatural stuff wasn't going to work the same way that like fantasy and magic worked. It's obviously a very different genre, and I just wasn't aware of it. And because I never read a paranormal before, I didn't realize that paranormal isn't so much for me. And then also, this was written very much set in 1920s. It wasn't like a normal story that happened to have happened in 1920s. No, this was like very much worded in the 1920s language, and it really threw me off, and I didn't exactly enjoy reading that style of writing. Also, because it was told in multiple perspectives, that kind of threw me off and made me really bored. Because when you're dealing with multiple perspectives, I'm kind of 50-50 on it. Unless I like every single character that has its own perspective, I tend to get bored when I'm reading their chapters. And in this instance, I didn't necessarily love every single character. So like half the book, I found myself really bored and kind of skimming through things, and it wasn't extremely enjoyable for me to read. Basically because of everything that this book was about. And I'm not saying that this isn't a good book. I mean, I happen to have found it really, really slow, and each book is really big. There's 4 books this size, and all of the words are quite tiny. So in my opinion, it was really slow, and also it took me a really long time to get through because I wasn't very much enjoying it. And I read all 4 books, even though I should have put this down at like the first 50 pages of the first book. But I didn't realize because I wanted to find out what everybody was so obsessed with about this book. And I realized that everything that they were obsessed with was the reasons why I didn't like it. And therefore, I'm not saying that this is a bad book by any means. If this sounds like it's something that's up your alley, then you'll probably really enjoy it. But for multiple reasons, like I already mentioned, this book just didn't vibe with me, and I really wish that I never bothered reading it. And the next series I wanted to talk about is a series that might be very controversial to bash, mostly because I know that so many people love it, but it wasn't for me. And anyway, that series is the Scythe series by Neil Shusterman, and it includes 3 books. It's the Scythe, Thunderhead, and The Toll. And if you're not familiar with what this book is about, this is basically a dystopian universe where technology has perfected life. Everything in life is absolutely perfect. Nobody can get sick. Nobody can die. Everybody has everything that they need. The only problem in the world is a population issue because nobody can die, but you can still have children. And therefore, there are these people called Scythes who are tasked in killing people to keep population down. And that is kind of the premise of the story. And there's a lot of politics in this. There are a lot of evil people, a lot of good people, and this book really goes places. It has a lot to do with technology and the thing called the Thunderhead, which basically rules the whole world. And in this book, you're basically following 2 Scythe apprentices who are training to become the next generation of Scythes. and their job for the rest of their life is going to be to have to kill people. And you're kind of following this story. It goes a lot of places. It's very interesting. And I gotta say, I absolutely loved the first book. But once you got into the second book and then the third book, it went like super downhill for me. Kinda, you know how like, okay, books kind of go like this? No, this went like off a cliff. Like, you know, basically, I loved the first book. I was really excited to read the rest of the series, and then I absolutely hated the rest of the series. Not only because of like where the story went, but I found that so much stuff happened in the first book, and really it took off in a direction of going in one place. And then the second and third book kind of just went like another way. Not necessarily like, oh, it was like, where the hell did this come from? But mostly like, I kind of got vibes from the first book, and then it didn't live up to my expectations in the rest of the books. Also, the first book is the smallest book, and then the second and third book get bigger and bigger. And I felt like it should have been backwards. Like the most interesting things happened in the first book and the least interesting things happened in the second book. So how did you somehow write so much more of nothing in the last book versus the first book? You know, so I found myself getting very bored throughout the second and third book. And I also didn't really like where the story went, and it really like bothered me for multiple reasons. And I understand why people like this series. It is very dystopian, and it happens to have a really good like storyline. I just wasn't an extreme fan of where this went. So I know that people love this series, and I kind of get it because it has a really cool storyline, but it just wasn't for me. So the next series I wanted to talk about is the Daughter of Smoke and Bone series by Laini Taylor. And this includes 3 books. It's The Daughter of Smoke and Bone, Days of Blood and Starlight, and Dreams of Gods and Monsters. And if you're not familiar with what this book is about, don't worry. I read the entire first book, and I still can't give you an exact synopsis for what it was. Basically, on the back of the book, it says, a devil and an angel falls in love and it doesn't go well. And when you read that, you kind of think, oh, this is going to be a romance fantasy. And it was, but the romance was super disappointing to me that I couldn't even concentrate on the fantasy part of this book, and therefore I absolutely hated it. Usually when I'm reading a romance fantasy, the romance is what pulls me through the book, and in this instance, I found the romance to be extremely disappointing. This was kind of like a love at first sight romance, and not necessarily that like I'm against that trope. Like I'm okay with it if it was done right, but I did not enjoy how it was done in this book. And therefore it distracted me so much that I couldn't even focus on the fantasy world of it. And therefore I absolutely hated this book. I wish that I put it down right away. I wish I didn't even bother reading the whole first book. I didn't read the second and third book, thank God. I didn't waste my time on it, even though I have a hard time putting series down, even if I'm not enjoying it, because I always think like, oh, it's going to turn around and it's going to get better because so many people recommended it and said that they loved it. So what is it that I'm missing? And I think it's just that people maybe liked the fantasy world part of it and the romance, and it's something that just didn't vibe with me. So therefore, I really, really wish I never heard of this book ever, and I never bothered reading it. And if you do like this book, I'm not necessarily bashing it. I'm just saying that this was not a book for me, and I really wish that I DNF'd it. So the next series I wanted to talk about is actually a duology. It's The Hazelwoods by Mellisa Albert, and this includes 2 books. It's The Hazelwood and The Night Country. And if you're not familiar with what this book is about, this is an urban fantasy, so it takes place in our real world, except there's like magical elements woven into it. And the whole idea of the story is that this girl and her mother have been on the run their whole life because they're being chased by these like supernatural things, and the girl has no idea why. The mother does, but you know, she never told her daughter. And anyway, the mother gets kidnapped by one of these people, and now she has to go and basically save her mother. But at the same time, her grandmother lives in the Hazelwood, and her grandmother is a very famous writer because like she wrote this grim fairy tale book that is like very hard to come by, and she's like this like unique, I don't know, interesting writer. Anyway, the grandmother died and she's kind of all on her own trying to save her mother. So the only thing that she knows is don't go into the Hazelwood. And what does she do? She goes into the Hazelwoods, and she basically finds out that all of the stories from her grandmother's grim fairy tale book is actually true, and they all take place in the Hazelwood. And the story kind of goes off from there, and there is a lot of twists and turns, and I found that the fairy tale part of this was very interesting because you get to read snippets from the actual book and you get to read these like short, grim fairy tales, and it's very interesting in that aspect. But in general, I found this book to be really boring. Like the whole time, I guess I wasn't exactly pulled into it, and I found myself looking up the whole time. And by the end of the book, I wasn't necessarily happy where everything left off leading into the second book. So I actually never even picked up the second book. Not that this was like the worst book I've ever read, but I found myself not interested enough to even bother picking up the second book. Even though the idea of the story sounds really interesting to me and something that was super up my alley, I found that I just wasn't a fan, and therefore I wish I didn't bother reading the entire book. Maybe I'll change my mind one day and pick it up again, but for now, that is how I feel. And if you do like this book, props to you. I'm not saying that it is a bad book whatsoever. This is just my personal opinion on it, and I wanted to share what I thought about this duology. And the last series I wanted to talk about for this video is actually a duology. It's called Vicious by V.E. Schwabb. So the first book is Vicious and the second book is Vengeful. And if you're not familiar with what this book is about, it is basically a dual timeline book where you're following these two characters as they are best friends in college doing their thesis, and then you're following them years later as they hate each other and are trying to like kill each other. And the story of it is that when they were in college, they were doing this thesis about trying to find out if you can scientifically give somebody superpowers. And basically they figure out how to do it, and for specific reasons they end up hating each other, and you're watching them again in the future trying to kill each other. And when you hear it, it sounds like it's going to be, you know, a pretty solid, interesting read. But right from the beginning, I wasn't pulled into the story and I found myself super bored. And not that I'm saying that this is a horrible book. This is just a book that was horrible to me. So if you love it, props to you. I'm happy that you enjoyed this book. I didn't. I somehow made it through the entire book, even though I really should have put it down right away. I was not vibing with this right from the beginning, but I always have a hard time doing that because when it comes highly recommended, I always think that I'm missing something and that I should get through it to see what was so good about it. But I think what everybody liked about it was the whole superpower thing about it, and they really enjoyed the main characters, and I just wasn't connected to any of the characters or their problems or anything like that, and therefore it wasn't a book for me. And I'm very happy that I never ended up reading the second book. I'm not even going to bother with it. One day I will probably either unhaul this or give it away or something like that, but anyway, I didn't like this book and I really wish I DNF'd it. But anyway, that is a handful of series and duologies that I wish I DNF'd. So I'm curious to know if you have like different opinions than I do about any of these series that I mentioned. I think that everybody has their own thoughts and opinions, and it's always interesting to hear someone else's opinion about it. So if you wanted to leave me a comment down below, I'd love to chat about it. Also, if maybe you felt the same way as I did, I'd love to hear that too, so that I'm not the only one who didn't like a series that everyone happened to have loved. But anyway, if you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and like always, thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it. And until next time, enjoy reading.